It's been a few months hiatus, but I am pleased to be back with another episode of the Talking Planning podcast. My last episode was released in the wake of the Lismore floods and looked at the importance of floodplain and natural disaster planning. I actually shelved today's episode in favour of that topic, but I'm very glad I did because elements of it, if I'd released this episode back in late March, would have aged like fine milk. In terms of bringing back the podcast now, I was kind of struggling to find the motivation to keep it going at the time. For those in the planning space in New South Wales, I think a lot of us have felt a little deflated thanks to a change in leadership direction, and that's meant there's been less emphasis on holistic decision making and more interest in supply side economics. So naturally at that point, I leant pretty hard on the transport side of things. Fortunately, transport planning, being a related but adjacent field, has fared a little better, perhaps because the transport sphere of influence gained that more holistic decision maker. Operationally, though, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. An extra smidgen of motivation to actually talk planning came from people defending public transport that's aging and has poor accessibility outcomes. So without further ado, let's talk housing. Since late March, the Australian economy has changed pretty significantly. The cash rate has climbed from a record low of 0.1% to 1.85% since May, and that's the highest it's been since April 2016. The Reserve Bank of Australia defines the cash rate as the interest rate on unsecured overnight loans between banks. It is the near risk-free benchmark rate for the Australian dollar. So I did a few units of an economics elective at uni, and it taught me that adjusting the cash rate is just one of many methods of trying to maintain price stability. But when it comes to planning, property and development, and the general household budget, adjusting the cash rate has quite direct consequences and almost immediately. Changing the cash rate often directly is mirrored or closely followed in mortgage and other lending rate increases, although it is kind of ironic to note that when the cash rate is reduced, it's not necessarily followed by a reduction in mortgage rates. Gotta love a double standard, right? And for those renting a property, it also means that many property owners are seeking to recover these increased mortgage costs. And at the end of leases, many people are finding that their rents are getting hiked up, often quite significantly. It's also very rare for rents to change if interest rates drop, and rents tend to only reduce when there are high vacancy rates in an area. And consequently, at the moment, vacancy rates are also at all-time lows in many parts of the country, including many of our regional towns. Rent and mortgage costs are only one of the many pressures that are on the household budget at the moment. And there's been significant increases in the cost of electricity and natural gas, the volatility of petrol and diesel, and of course, the cost of basic groceries. These cost increases can be attributed to many factors, including poor harvests for some crops, constraints on oil and gas supplies thanks to conflict, lack of skilled staff and staffing shortages, and supply chain constraints. Of course, many input costs have also increased. Unfortunately, there are some bad eggs out there using this as an opportunity to raise prices despite limited or no change in input costs because people are expecting prices to go up. While I've done a few economics units during my degree, I am by no means a full expert in the field. And of course, there are other macroeconomic approaches to trying to maintain price stability rather than just changing the cash rate, like the Reserve Bank purchasing and selling bonds or securities. The cash rate, though, is important because its relationship to mortgage costs is very significant, and with most banks passing on rate increases in full, or a substantial part of that increase following the Reserve Bank announcements. And in a country where home ownership is so deeply embedded in culture that it has dream status attached to it, many of us looking to buy, or those who have recently bought property, often at premium prices, are going to continue to feel the strain more than ever before. In some ways, the security that is promised by the Great Australian Dream is having the opposite effect. Many see renting as a short-term stopgap rather than a viable longer-term housing option, which it's presented as in many other countries. Renting a property is treated as a short-term decision, with short-term contracts, and fairly limited autonomy for a lot of tenants. And while many in the property buying space are content with buying a place for themselves and their families as owner-occupiers, property investing is also a popular component of the Great Australian Dream. Australia's taxation laws are quite unique, and it means that rental losses can be often used as offsets against other income, reducing the amount of tax you're paying. This practice is often known as negative gearing, and it's a hotly debated topic. Some suggest it actually encourages more houses to be put into the rental market, allowing for otherwise vacant properties to be put into the rental pool. But on the other hand, many argue it actually has the opposite effect, with investors taking on more and more properties, using losses to offset personal income, and still collecting market rate or near market rates anyway. But of course, in either circumstance, if an investor ends up receiving more money than the cost of upkeep, mortgage, and the usual fees, you're still having net rental income anyway. If anyone knows of any studies that try and quantify those impacts of negative gearing on housing affordability, I would love to know because I think it would be a really interesting read. Having talked about both renting and buying briefly, it's important to look at the nuances of lawful occupation of a property, and there are a few main methods. The ones obviously that we think of off the top of our heads are renting a property either on a private rental market or through some form of assisted rental scheme. You can purchase a property with a mortgage and repay the bank. You can own a property outright with no money owing. That usually takes a while. You can inherit a property, or you can be allocated property via social or public housing schemes. There are some other methods of occupation I haven't mentioned yet, some with varied legality, such as squatters' rights, where long-term occupiers of land who are not recognised on title or renting from an owner are granted legal ownership after continuous possession of a vacant property for an extended period. Rules vary state by state, but usually require a very long time and very long history of occupying that property. But there was a certain Greens councillor in Brisbane who decided his own take on the practice. Starting, obviously I would never encourage anyone to break the law, and this is just hypothetical advice, was the disclaimer given after he identified a fairly robust process on how to pick a suitable location to find a vacant property to squat in. I don't want to go too much into the details on this, but it's not the approach I would take. Fortunately, there are some less legally dubious ways that the planning industry can provide a sensible response to the ongoing housing affordability crisis. I think almost always increasing the supply of social and affordable housing comes up as a need in response to worsening housing affordability. And I can't argue with it. There's a clear need for more action, especially as more and more people are in financial stress. Many who just a couple of years ago we would have thought were doing all right, and they're now making quite difficult sacrifices to make ends meet. One of the biggest challenges for social housing is that all three tiers of government, local, state, and federal, are now under pressure to rein in spending and control debts. And this makes it really difficult for even very worthy causes to obtain funding. Complicating matters further, social housing is typically funded and delivered only at a state level, and that limits the influence that local government has over affordable housing supply. Federal government has a bigger role that they can play here by supporting the states, but it's not necessarily a fast process. In preparing this, I also read up on the Greek government debt crisis, and I hope that we don't go down that path, but there is an important need to balance sensible spending and sensible policy to avoid unpalatable austerity measures. So here are some interim options we could be considering. One of the ones that I was thinking of was embedding the delivery of social housing into assessment codes, development control plans, or whatever the state equivalent is for apartment development, new residential subdivision, or larger infill proposals. In New South Wales, we have the Housing State Environmental Planning Policy, the Housing SEP, and that has specific requirements for developing new affordable housing. I think these policies are a good start, but I think a potential next step forward would be for plans and policies to expect or even mandate a portion of new dwellings in a development be reserved for social housing. This also sends a clear message to the development industry that they need to be part of the solution. It might sound radical, but it mightn't be as radical as you might think. We already expect developers to pay contributions charges, and we do allow them to dedicate land as a material public benefit. In the same form, you could dedicate lots, dwellings, or apartments to government social housing and capture that benefit in a similar model. For residents of social housing, being co-located in another development also provides the benefit of integrating people better into a community, rather than pushing people to the fringes, and that allows for better inclusion and often helps actually reduce the cost of living. If you live in a development closer to shops, transport and services, some of your other costs will reduce too. Unfortunately, something that might be a bit of a risk for this approach is that a recent proposal through Victorian Parliament to value capture rezoned land was rejected. This sets a precedent that might make it more difficult for such a proposal to be adopted in other jurisdictions. Another option that gets talked about frequently is rent control. This approach sets a maximum rental price, which economists will call a price ceiling, and this approach has been tested in several US cities, including San Francisco and New York. It's considered a fairly controversial practice, like many market interventions are. Unfortunately, this probably wasn't so successful, with rent control leading in some cases to black market rents. Owners were expecting and asking for additional charges beyond the advertised price to cover what they believed to be the fair value of the property. Obviously, this approach is not legal, but it's quite difficult to crack down on such behaviour, and it has led to debate on whether rent control is actually effective. Given the jury's out on this one, I think there are some other options we could explore. The Australian Council on Social Services, or ACOS, uses an affordability benchmark of 30% of household income as being a general affordable level for the cost of housing. Let's take someone earning $70,000 a year, which many would consider a good salary, and looking at the ATO tax calculator, they'd be expected to pay around $12,000 in tax. That would result in a take-home pay of just over $1,000 a week. By that metric, your spending on housing should be around $300 a week. If you're looking for a rental property in this price range, particularly in a metropolitan city, good luck! Conversely, it would be also quite difficult to get a mortgage of around $1,200 to $1,400 a month on similar properties in similar areas. You might get a one-bedroom if you're lucky, but probably not. And if you're in a regional centre, thanks to changing lifestyle habits, many property costs have risen much faster than their urban counterparts. And this puts extreme pressure on markets where incomes are often below the national or state averages. As you would know though, applying a blanket affordability benchmark doesn't really capture the nuances of total costs in a market. And keep in mind, housing is just one component of a budget. So, good transport connections to access local goods and services, maybe the reduced need to own or drive a car, might make it appropriate to put a slightly larger portion of the budget towards housing. This does have a practical limit, however, and unfortunately, in many cases, locations with good access to shops and services and less need to drive are not a few percent more in cost, but instead significantly more expensive. Putting the strategic planning hat on, taking a long-term view of better housing choice and affordability is, I think, where the planning profession can best influence this topic. We often talk about the missing middle, and that is properties in between single-family dwellings, dwelling houses, or whatever naming convention applies to a single house on land, and larger apartment developments, is a primary opportunity that we can provide choice that better meets household needs. Think of townhouses, 2 3-story mixed developments, and shop top housing, and you'll get what I mean by the missing middle. You don't see it often, but it's a really important type of use. These designs are about providing balance, with an urban form that feels comfortable, a reduced cost to supply infrastructure compared to standalone houses, and services make it easier for communities to develop and grow, especially when mixed use properties are included in the mix. Transport and land use integration is also critical in this conversation, and active transport, including walking, cycling, and personal mobility devices like e-bikes or e-scooters, when combined with lower speed shared streets, are brilliant for short to medium trips. This is where terms like the 15-minute city come about, and in regional contexts, these approaches may even be able to cover a whole town or a fairly large sub-precinct of it. Of course, as you probably know by this channel, public transport is really important, and inter-suburb, inter-town, and inter-regional journeys can be served from a variety of transport modes, from localised on-demand buses right through to heavy rail, faster rail services, and air transport. Reducing the need to drive always has benefits, with people being more active and gaining incidental exercise, reducing the cost associated with buying, operating, and maintaining a private car, and it helps to create spaces that encourage people to stop and stay. This is good for business too, because people who are walking are often people who are spending. Unfortunately, housing affordability isn't something that we're going to solve overnight, and there's need to have robust and often difficult conversations to make meaningful and positive change. The planning profession does play a really important role in this discussion, particularly in long-term decision making, and through good design practices, we can do a lot to shape affordability. Unfortunately, when it comes to actions today, it's something that the planning space probably has a little less influence and support on. And it's really about how policymakers can work collaboratively with social advocacy groups, industry experts, and government leaders to get the right balance. There's certainly more to have in this discussion, but I think we should save that for another time. So, thank you for joining me, and I will see you again soon.